The outskirts of Silver Creek looked even rougher than the rest of the small frontier town. A strip of hard-packed earth where traveling fairs set up whenever they drifted through, dotted with torn canvas tents held up by mismatched poles, crude stalls selling cheap trinkets, and horses tied to splintered rails. Dust drifted constantly across the ground as if nothing ever settled here for long. The Wyoming heat pushed down without relief, making tempers short and laughter sharp. The smell of sweat, animal hide, spilled whiskey, and old timber clung to everything. Mason Reed stepped through the fairground at a careful pace, his boots landing heavily, his hat angled low to keep the glare out of his eyes. He carried the look of a man who had been on the move for a long time. Coat faded from sun, shirt collar frayed, a scar running along his jaw like an old reminder of the life he used to live. His Colt single-action army hung at his hip, worn smooth at the grip from years of use. The holster showed the subtle marks of a man who had drawn that weapon more times than he cared to remember. His body moved with the steady strength of someone who had worked ranches, ridden trails, and fought more than he ever wanted to. But his face held something quieter, the expression of a man who didn't expect to belong anywhere anymore. He had arrived in Silver Creek only that morning. He didn't come for entertainment or work. He came because he needed a place to stop, eat, repair his saddle, and decide where he was going next. He had no mission except survival and perhaps the faint hope of finding a place that didn't remind him of what he had lost. A group of working girls called to him from beside the saloon tent, their faces painted bright against the drab surroundings. Mason touched the brim of his hat in polite acknowledgement, but kept walking. One of the women whispered something to her companions that made them laugh. Mason didn't react. He'd heard it all before. He didn't want people. He didn't want noise. But noise found him anyway. Shouting grew louder near the center of the fair where a crowd of men gathered around a raised wooden platform made of cheap boards hammered together in a hurry. Laughter rolled through the air, not friendly, not amused, but coarse and mocking. Mason slowed, not because he was curious, but because something in the tone of that laughter made him uneasy. He had heard that kind of sound before in mining camps, outlaw towns, and army posts, usually when someone weaker was being cornered. He angled himself slightly, enough to see past two men blocking the view, and then he froze. A young Apache woman stood on the platform with her wrists bound in front of her. Rawhide cut into her skin, leaving red marks. Dust covered her ankles, her legs, her dress. Her long black hair fell around her shoulders in tangled strands, a few leather-braided pieces hanging at the sides. A small tribal tattoo marked her wrist, barely visible beneath the bindings, but significant to those who knew Apache customs, the mark of someone of importance. Her bronze skin caught the sun in an uneven way, showing exhaustion, hunger, and days of mistreatment. Her torn deerskin dress clung awkwardly to her body. One side seam had split high up her thigh from rough handling. The neckline was stretched out and torn, exposing the soft line of her collarbone. The dress wasn't made to reveal anything. Its damage did that for her. The crowd looked at her like she was merchandise. But Mason didn't stare at her dress or her curves or the way the men leaned in to get a better look. He focused on her eyes, dark brown, distant, hollow. Eyes that didn't fight anymore. Eyes that reminded him of men he'd seen on battlefields right after they realized they weren't going home. Something tightened in his chest, a mix of anger, guilt, and an instinct he didn't even recognize at first. Protectiveness, the kind that didn't flare, but settled in heavy and cold. The showman strutted across the platform, waving a pistol and calling out loud enough for half the fair to hear. 3 bottles, 3 shots. Win the Apache girl. The crowd cheered. Mason felt his jaw lock. His mind worked quickly, not with panic, but with controlled awareness, the same way it used to when a situation was about to turn ugly, and he had to decide whether to walk away or step in. Deep down, he already knew he wasn't walking away. His heartbeat picked up, steady but hard. Something about the woman, the way she held herself upright despite humiliation, the quiet in her stare pulled him in before he could stop it. He took in everything at once. The men pressing forward, some drunk, some excited. The showman enjoying the cruelty, the woman breathing slowly like she was trying not to show fear. Mason didn't like to interfere in other people's business. He learned that getting involved often made things worse. But this wasn't business. This was wrong, plain and simple. And leaving her there would stay with him long after he rode out of town. He stepped toward the booth. If anyone noticed the change in the air around him, they didn't show it. But Mason felt it, his body shifting into the same steady focus he used to get when things turned dangerous. His hands didn't shake, his breath stayed even. The years on the trail had worn him down, but they hadn't taken his aim. The showman noticed him approaching and brightened instantly. "Well now," he yelled, "looks like we got a quiet one. Who wants to try?" Mason didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out a silver dollar, and placed it on the table without looking at the man. He didn't like gambling, and he didn't like playing games, but he understood the rules here. The girl wouldn't walk off that platform unless he followed them. The man slid a pistol toward him, an old, poorly maintained weapon with a loose cylinder and too much grit in the chamber. Mason lifted it, tested the balance, and raised it with smooth practiced control of a man who had fired more than his share of guns. No showmanship, no hesitation. The crowd fell quiet, sensing something different. Mason aimed, his thoughts narrowed. Don't miss. Don't drag this out. End it fast. The first shot cracked through the air and shattered the bottle instantly. A few men cursed under their breath. Mason realigned the barrel with almost mechanical precision. Second shot, another clean break. Voices shifted from amusement to tension. The third bottle wavered in the breeze, but his grip stayed steady. He breathed out slowly and fired. The last bottle exploded into fragments that scattered across the platform. Silence hit the yard. Nobody cheered, nobody joked, they just stared. The showman forced a smile and raised his hands. "Well, well," he said loudly. "Looks like the lady's got a new—" Mason cut him a sharp look that made the man stop mid-sentence. He walked forward with controlled steps, aware of the eyes on him, aware the woman was still standing rigid, waiting for whatever came next. The showman hopped down and sliced the rawhide around her wrists, but he shoved her forward as he did it, treating her like livestock. "Don't touch her again." Mason's voice came out low and dangerous. The showman stopped cold. The woman held her wrists close to her chest, rubbing them gently. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She just looked at Mason with a mixture of fear, confusion, and something deeper he couldn't place. She had seen men win things before. She had likely been one before. She didn't know what he expected from her. Mason didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her arms. He kept his hands at his sides, open and empty. "You walk with me if you want," he said quietly, watching her reaction with careful attention. "You're not owned. I'm just getting you out of here." She stared at him for a long moment, searching for the trick, the trap, the part where he became like the others. But his face didn't change. No hunger, no pressure, no demand, just steady, tired patience. Finally, she gave a small, uncertain nod. Mason stepped aside so she had space to walk on her own. When she moved past him, she didn't touch him, but she stayed close. Close enough to show she wanted to leave the crowd, but not close enough to show trust. He didn't rush her. They walked slowly toward the edge of the fair, the noise fading behind them, the dust settling around their feet. And as they crossed into the quieter part of Silver Creek, Mason felt the weight of a decision settle on his shoulders. One that he didn't regret, but one he knew would change the course of his life in ways he wasn't ready to admit. He had come to town for rest. He was leaving with responsibility, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like running from it. They walked away from the fairground without speaking. The noise behind them faded into a dull echo as the open street of Silver Creek stretched ahead. The town wasn't big, just a scattering of wooden storefronts, weather-beaten signs, and a few men leaning against posts watching everything that moved. But it looked enormous, unpredictable, full of unfamiliar eyes to the Apache woman. She kept her steps measured, close enough to Mason to show she didn't want to be left alone, but not close enough to touch him. Her shoulders stayed stiff, her breathing shallow. Every sound made her flinch slightly, a reaction Mason noticed each time. He kept his pace slow on purpose. He didn't look at her directly, knowing sudden attention sometimes frightened people who had been handled roughly, but he observed her in his quiet way. How she held her bound wrist tightly against her stomach, how she scanned the street for exits, how her bare feet inside of those thin moccasins dragged from exhaustion. He could see she hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe longer. A few people stared openly, others whispered. Most looked away quickly, unwilling to get involved with anything that might bring trouble. Mason ignored them. His focus stayed on keeping distance between the woman and the man who wandered too close. When one ranch hand stepped forward, as if curious, Mason turned his head and gave a look sharp enough to cut the air between them. The man stepped back immediately. As they neared the livery stable, she slowed. She looked at the building with uncertainty, her eyes flicking between the doors, the roof line, the shadows inside. The question she didn't voice was clear enough. Is this where he takes me? What does he expect? Mason stopped too, turning slightly so she could see his face without feeling cornered. There's a room above the livery, he said, speaking evenly. I rented it this morning. You can rest there. No one will bother you. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, not anger but caution. She had likely been promised safety before. He continued quietly. I sleep downstairs in the tack room, separate. The tension in her shoulders changed, not disappearing, but shifting as if his words removed one fear, but left a dozen others. She looked at him. Really looked, trying to measure what kind of man he was. His face wasn't soft, but it wasn't hungry either. He didn't linger on her torn dress. He didn't reach for her, he simply waited for her decision. She finally nodded. Inside the livery, the stable hand, an older man named Whit, lifted his head as they entered. His eyes lingered on her torn dress, then flicked to Mason, silently asking if trouble was following. Mason shook his head once. I'm using the room upstairs, Mason said. Need water and a blanket. Whit handed them over without questions. The way Mason moved, the way he kept himself between the woman and the doorway told Whit everything he needed to know. Whatever story lay behind this, the cowboy wasn't looking to hurt anyone. Mason led her upstairs, stopping at the top of the narrow wooden steps. He didn't enter first. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured. You go ahead, he said. You'll feel safer seeing the place before I walk in. She hesitated. She didn't trust doors. She didn't trust closed rooms, but she stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning every wall, every corner. The room was small, a cot against one wall, a wash basin, a table with one stool, and a single window overlooking the dusty street. Simple but clean. No ropes, no chains, no hidden men. She exhaled quietly, a tiny sound, almost nothing, but Mason heard it. He stayed in the doorway. You can lock the door from the inside, he said. I won't try to come in. Another pause. She tested the latch gently. It worked. She looked back at him with a mixture of confusion and stress. It was the first time she had been offered privacy in a very long time, and she didn't know what to do with it. He set the blanket on the table and placed the water jug down slowly, avoiding sudden movements. Tell me if you need anything, he said. Food, bandages, space. He lifted a hand briefly, not to touch her, but to show honesty. You're not a prize, you're not owned. I just didn't want to leave you with that man. She stared at him, her eyes searching for lies. She didn't trust his kindness. She couldn't, not yet. But there was no fear in her gaze now, only confusion and something faintly like relief. When she didn't answer, Mason stepped back toward the stairs. I'll be downstairs, he said. The latch will hold. She watched him go until his boots disappeared down the steps. For a long moment, she stood in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, breathing slowly, as if the air felt different here. She touched her wrists, red and tender from the rawhide. She touched the torn edge of her dress, not with shame, but with the practicality of someone who had worn damaged clothes before. Her eyes drifted to the window. She checked the street, expecting someone to follow. No one did. Below, Mason settled into a chair in the tack room, elbows on his knees, hands folded. He stared at the floorboards above him, listening to her footsteps. His mind replayed everything. Those empty eyes on the platform, the torn dress, the way the crowd watched her like an object. He felt anger again. But more than that, he felt responsibility. He did not know her name. He did not know where she came from. He did not know what she wanted now that she was free of the fairground. But he knew one thing clearly. He wasn't riding out of town until he was sure she was safe. Outside the stable, he noticed a few men from the fair drifting around, pretending to loiter. He knew what that meant. They weren't done with what they thought they lost. He rested a hand on the gun at his hip. If they tried anything, they'd have to go through him. Upstairs, the woman moved to the cot and sat carefully, her breathing still slow, her body tired. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and looked toward the door again. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to lie back, not deeply, not fully trusting, but enough to feel the difference between captivity and a small room offered without demand. Her thoughts were tangled with fear, exhaustion, and a cautious curiosity. Why did he help her? What did he want? Would he leave? Would others come? But one thought felt solid even in the uncertainty. He didn't try to touch her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the first sliver of safety settle in the quiet space. Downstairs, Mason leaned back, exhaled, and accepted the new truth settling over him like a slow weight. He had no intention of walking away from this woman or whatever danger followed her. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. Night settled over Silver Creek slowly, bringing a cooler wind that pushed dust across the street in thin sheets. Lanterns flickered along the storefronts, and most of the fairground noise faded as the crowd drifted toward the saloons. Inside the livery, the light dimmed to a warm orange glow that reached only the edges of the tack room where Mason sat, elbows on his knees, listening to the faint movements above him. Every small sound, footsteps shifting on the wooden floor, the creak of the cot, the soft thud of the water jug, told him she was still awake. He didn't blame her. After what she'd been through, sleep wouldn't come easily. He leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight, and rubbed a hand over his jaw. His thoughts kept circling the same questions, ones he hadn't let himself ask in front of her. Who had taken her? How long had she been held? Was someone looking for her? Were the men from the fair the only danger here? Or was there someone worse? Most importantly, would she want to stay with him once she could make her own choices? He didn't like the way that last question tightened his chest. Upstairs, the woman sat with her knees pulled close, wrapped in the blanket. She hadn't removed her dress, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know if she was safe long enough to lie down unguarded. She listened carefully to the noises outside the window, watching shadows move along the street. At one point, she heard two men talking and recognized their voices from the fair. Their tone was low and angry. She didn't understand the words, but she understood intentions. They hadn't forgotten her. She stood and moved to the window, keeping herself hidden behind the curtain. She looked down and saw them, two ranch hands lingering near the edge of the stable, pretending to check their horses, but glancing toward the building too much. She pulled back quickly, her heart thudding in her chest. Then her eyes turned to the door. The latch was still down. Mason told her it would hold, but she had lived through enough escapes and captures to know that locks didn't stop determined men. She moved toward the stairs, stopping halfway down where she could see Mason without needing to go all the way into the room. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. He didn't rise quickly or reach for her, and that made her pause less. She pointed toward the window above and said softly, "Men outside." His jaw tensed, and he stood, the movement slow and controlled, so she wouldn't flinch. "Same ones from the fair?" he asked. She nodded once. Mason stepped past her to the front of the stable doors and pushed them open enough to see the yard. The men were exactly where she said, leaning against the rail, pretending to smoke, staring at the building every few seconds. Mason watched them for a moment with the calm calculation of someone who had handled trouble before. Then he shut the doors quietly. "They won't come inside with wit here," he said, "but they might try something after he closes up." She didn't understand every word, but she understood the worry in his tone. She stepped back slightly, not out of fear of him, but because she didn't want to be in his way. Mason looked at her hands. They were trembling, barely, but enough for him to notice. "You hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice soft. She hesitated. Hunger was a vulnerable answer, but she nodded. He motioned gently toward the stairs. "Stay in the room, I'll bring food up." Her eyes narrowed with uncertainty, not distrust, but habit. So he added quietly, "I'll leave it at the door if you want." That eased her posture a little. Before she returned upstairs, she paused, touching the sleeve of his coat lightly with two fingers. The gesture wasn't affection, It was communication. Thank you, I understand. Please, be careful. He gave a small nod back. Mason stepped out the side door toward the hotel kitchen where he knew he could buy a plate of stew and bread at this hour. He walked with the kind of deliberate steadiness that didn't draw attention, but warned anyone watching that he wasn't an easy target. The two ranch hands straightened when he passed, clearly reevaluating whether following the Apache woman had been worth the risk. Mason didn't stop, didn't look at them long, just enough to let them know he had seen them, measured them, dismissed them. Inside the kitchen, he paid for the food, wrapped it, and headed back quickly. The whole time, he kept the woman in his thoughts. The way she had scanned exits, the way she had braced herself when he stepped too close, the way she looked half-starved and half-frozen in that torn dress. When he returned, he found Whit locking up the front doors for the night. "You bring trouble with you?" Whit asked under his breath. "Not if they're smart," Mason replied. Whit snorted and headed home. Mason waited until his footsteps faded before he entered the stable and climbed the stairs. He stopped at the door and knocked once. "Food," Mason called softly. There was a moment of silence. Then the latch clicked. The door opened only a small amount, just enough for her hand to reach through and take the bowl and bread. She didn't open the door fully. She didn't trust that yet. Mason respected it. As she pulled the food inside, he spoke in a low tone that wouldn't carry. "I'll stay in the tack room until morning. No one will come up here. If anyone tries, you shout. I'll hear you." The door closed slowly, not with fear, but with thoughtfulness. She was considering his words, measuring them, deciding whether she believed him. Inside, she sat on the edge of the cot and ate cautiously, quietly, savoring each bite like someone who had gone days without meals she could finish peacefully. Her hands steadied as she ate. Her breathing slowed. For the first time since her capture, she felt the slightest bit of control returning to her. Downstairs, Mason stretched out on the cot in the tack room, hand behind his head, listening for sounds outside. Every time footsteps approached the stable, he stiffened and reached for his gun. But the men didn't try anything. Not tonight. Still, he kept one eye open. Sleep didn't come easy for either of them. The woman lay awake upstairs, trying to understand her own fear and her growing curiosity about the quiet man downstairs. Why he helped her. Why he kept his distance. Why he didn't ask for anything. Mason stayed awake, wondering how far he was willing to go to protect her. Both of them strangers hours ago now lay under the same roof, listening for danger and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Neither knowing that their lives had already begun to shift in ways neither had planned. And somewhere outside in the dark edges of Silver Creek, the men from the fair weren't finished watching. Dawn broke pale and cold over Silver Creek, spreading a soft gray light across the empty street. The fairground was silent now, canvas tents sagging after the long night, dust settled in thin layers over everything. Inside the livery, Mason opened his eyes before the sun fully rose. He hadn't slept much. Every shift of wind against the stable walls, every creak of wood had kept him half alert. He listened first, an old habit, checking for footsteps outside or movement upstairs. When nothing sounded wrong, he stood slowly, stretching stiff muscles that had grown too used to sleeping in uncomfortable places. Upstairs, he heard faint movement, not the panic sounds of someone trying to escape, just soft steps, the kind that meant she had been awake for a while. Mason climbed halfway up the stairs and stopped at the landing so she could hear him but not feel crowded. "I'm making coffee," he said quietly. "If you want some, I'll leave a cup by the door." There was a pause, then the muted sound of the latch lifting. The door didn't open all the way, only enough for her to look out with cautious eyes. Her hair was loose now, falling over her shoulders in a heavy black sheet. She still wore the torn dress, but she had wrapped the blanket around her waist to cover the split seam. Her expression was guarded, but less hollow than yesterday. "Coffee?" she echoed softly, testing the English word. He nodded once. "Hot helps clear the morning." She considered this, then gave the smallest nod, not of trust, but of acceptance. She disappeared back into the room and Mason went downstairs to start the fire. As the smell of boiling coffee drifted through the stable, she stepped quietly around the upstairs room, inspecting her surroundings again in morning light. She checked the window, the door, the walls, making sure no one had come in while she slept. The fact that everything was untouched brought a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. caution mixed with a surprising calm. She ran her fingers along the bruises at her wrists, the marks left by the rawhide. They were dark purple now. She wasn't used to someone removing bindings without replacing them with something else. Her thoughts moved cautiously through the events of yesterday, trying to understand the cowboy downstairs. He hadn't watched her the way other men did. He didn't demand anything, didn't touch her, didn't even stay near her door. Why? Downstairs, Mason poured 2 tin cups of coffee, carrying one up to the landing. He set it gently on the floor, then stepped back down a few steps to give her space. The door opened again, just enough for her to extend her arm and take the cup. Her fingers trembled slightly around the metal, but she held it steady. She lifted it to her nose first, smelling the bitter scent, then took a careful sip. The heat surprised her, and she swallowed slowly. Good? Mason asked. She nodded once, then repeated the word with more confidence. Good. He allowed himself a small, brief smile. She saw it through the cracked door and blinked as if unprepared for it. She closed the door again, but not abruptly this time. Mason went about feeding his horse and checking the stable yard. The morning brought a chance to see things clearly, and what he saw didn't sit right with him. Footprints in the dirt, fresh, leading toward the stable and back out. The distinct shape of 2 different boots. Someone had come close during the night. Whit arrived a few minutes later, whistling as he entered, but the sound cut short when he saw Mason crouched by the tracks. Those weren't here yesterday, Mason said. Whit frowned. Saw a couple fellas hanging around late. Thought they were drunk. Mason stood, brushing dust from his hands. They weren't drunk. Whit lowered his voice. You plan on keeping the girl here long? Mason didn't answer at first, not because he didn't know, but because the truth surprised even him. For now, he said finally, until I figure out what those men want. Whit held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. You do what you need to, just don't bring the whole town's trouble down on this stable. Mason almost said he couldn't promise that, but held his tongue. Instead, he went upstairs again, knocking lightly. When she opened the door a sliver, he spoke in a calm, even tone. I need to ask you something. She stiffened, not with fear, but with the instinct of someone who had been questioned before by people who didn't care about her answers. He kept his voice steady. Those men outside, they followed you from somewhere before the fair. She hesitated. Her breathing quickened slightly. Not panic, painful memory. Then she nodded. He waited but didn't push for more. She surprised him by continuing on her own, speaking in her careful, accented English. Taken near river, 3 days, many men, sold, traded, then sold again. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. Last man, bring me to fair. Mason felt something tighten inside him, something quiet but sharp. He kept his expression under control, but his jaw clenched. Were they soldiers? He asked carefully. Or outlaws, or... He didn't finish the question. He didn't want to put words in her mouth. She shook her head. Us soldiers, drunk men looking for trade. Then fight. Then I run. They catch again. Mason exhaled slowly through his nose. That explained the torn dress, the bruises, the exhaustion. It also explained why the men outside weren't giving up. She looked at him carefully, trying to judge if he believed her or if he would turn against her like others had. But Mason's face had changed in a different way, a quiet, controlled anger that wasn't aimed at her. He nodded once, thank you for telling me. She looked relieved, not because the truth was out, but because he didn't accuse her, didn't question her worth, didn't speak to her like something owned. He stepped back down the stairs. You stay inside today. Don't open the door unless it's me or Whit. She watched him go with a new expression. Not trust, not yet, but something close to willingness. Mason saddled his horse a few minutes later, tightening the cinch with deliberate strength. If the men outside thought she was unprotected, they were wrong. He had questions to ask around town about the fair, about the traders, about the men who had been lingering. He was beginning to understand something he hadn't admitted to himself. He wasn't helping her because he won her in a game. He was helping her because she had no one else. As he mounted up, she watched him through the upstairs window. She didn't understand why he was leaving, but sensed it wasn't abandonment. His posture was different from the men who deserted her before. He didn't ride for freedom. He rode with purpose. And in that moment, for the first time since she had been taken, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Mason wrote it out with the same controlled focus he used during trail jobs years ago. His eyes scanning the street, the alleys, and the faces of anyone watching him pass. The horse moved at a steady walk, its hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that drifted across the morning air. He wasn't heading anywhere specific. He was circling the town, taking the long route, making himself visible. So the men from the fair understood one thing. He wasn't hiding and he wasn't afraid to be seen. Inside the makeshift sheriff's office, a small room with a warped desk and a wall of outdated wanted posters, he asked a few questions. Nothing direct, nothing that would draw suspicion, just enough to get the answers he needed. The sheriff wasn't in. The deputy sat behind the desk, boots up, half asleep. Fair brought in rough men this time, Mason said. The deputy stirred, shrugging. Yeah, a bunch of drifters and gamblers, a couple of ranch hands from down south. Trouble types. Two of them hanging around the livery last night, Mason replied. Like they lost something. The deputy rolled his eyes. Probably drunk. Mason didn't bother correcting him. Some men could identify danger. Others couldn't see it even when it stood in front of them, holding a knife. He asked a few more questions quietly about the fair owner, the traveling groups, any Apache captives brought through recently. The answers weren't encouraging. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted to admit they saw anything. No one wanted responsibility. But as he was leaving, an old trapper smoking a pipe outside mentioned something that made Mason pause. Them ranch hands ain't just ranch hands. They ride with Jake Harlan sometimes. Him and his boys been taking Indians up north. Army pays for information, and them tribes pay ransom for important folk. Mason kept his expression neutral, but his mind was working quickly. Harlan. He'd heard that name on the trail, a bounty hunter who didn't care much about bringing men back alive. This Harlan in town? Mason asked casually. The trapper shook his head. Not yet, but where his boys are, he ain't far behind. Mason nodded his thanks and walked away, his mind circling the new information. If the Apache woman was valuable to someone like Harlan, she was more than just a random captive. The small tattoo on her wrist, the quality of her dress despite its damage, the way she carried herself even in fear, it all suggested someone of importance, someone worth coming after. He rode back toward the stable, his decision already made. They couldn't stay in town, not with Harlan possibly on his way. The man had a reputation for persistence, and more importantly, for cruelty. Upstairs, the woman watched him return through the narrow gap of the window, the blanket still wrapped around her lower half. She hadn't eaten since the night before, except for a little bread she saved. Fear wasn't eating at her now. Uncertainty was. She kept expecting him to bring news that she had to be moved, hidden, handed over to some authority. She had learned that even men with good intentions could become frightened when danger grew close. When Mason walked into the stable, she stepped back from the window, not wanting him to see how closely she had been watching. She listened for his boots on the stairs. They came a minute later. He stopped at the landing, keeping his voice soft so she wouldn't feel cornered. Got food, he said, going to leave it by the door. She opened the door slightly, not wide, not inviting, just enough to show she wasn't afraid of him. The morning light touched her face, showing the fading bruises, the tired eyes, the tension that still lived in her shoulders. He held out the plate. Eggs, beans, bread. She hesitated, then took it carefully. There's something I need to tell you, he said. I asked around town, enough to get answers. She braced, her fingers tightening around the plate. You're not wanted for anything, he said. No bounty, no lawmen looking. The men who took you weren't part of a gang anyone recognizes. Just drifters. Mean ones. She lowered her eyes and nodded slowly. It matched what she already knew. She had been taken for profit, not politics. Mason continued, still calm, still deliberate. But they're still here, 2 of them at least. They've been asking questions around the saloon. She swallowed hard. Won't take me again, she said. Her voice held the edge of someone who had already decided to die fighting rather than be captured a second time. No, Mason agreed. His breathing hitched, and he made a conscious effort to soften his posture, not stepping closer, not raising his voice. "I won't let that happen." She lifted her gaze to him, then, not defiant, not pleading, studying his face with the serious weight of someone deciding whether to believe a promise. He didn't blink. "You're safe here," he said, "but this town won't stay safe for long. Too many strangers, too many eyes." She understood his meaning. Staying would draw trouble. Leaving would risk everything. He looked toward the street through the window behind her. "There's a cabin of mine west of here. About a day's ride, remote, quiet. Nobody finds it unless they're looking hard." She stiffened, not with fear of the cabin, but with the sudden realization that he was offering more than a hiding place. He was offering responsibility, protection, work, supplies, and risk all at once. "You want me to go?" she asked carefully. He shook his head once. "Not want. I'm asking if you feel safer away from town. Your choice." She didn't speak at first. She set the plate down slowly on the table, her fingers tapping against the wood as she weighed the decision. She thought about the fare, the men, the long days tied, the nights worse than days. She thought about yesterday, Mason stepping between her and a crowd without hesitation. And she thought about the room upstairs, the lock that held, the food left at the door without demand, the coffee offered without pressure. Then she said quietly, "Cabin better." Mason nodded, relieved, but careful not to show too much of it. "We can leave at first light tomorrow," he said. "Travel slower with supplies and only one horse. But we'll make it." Her eyes flicked up sharply. "One horse?" "Yes." She looked away for a moment, remembering the forced rides, the rough hands, the men who used proximity as an excuse for harm. Her stomach tightened. Mason noticed the flash of fear and addressed it immediately. "You'll ride in front," he said. "Not behind. I won't crowd you. You set the pace, Wurigamum." Her shoulders loosened slightly. "And if you prefer," he added, "I can walk beside the horse until you're comfortable." She stared at him again with that searching look, trying to find a crack in the offer, but his face stayed steady. No expectation, no hidden intention. Finally, she said, "I ride in front." He nodded once. "We'll do it your way." She hesitated before closing the door, then said something so soft he almost missed it. "My name, Nara." Mason's eyes softened just enough to be noticeable. "Mason," he answered. Her lips parted slightly in acknowledgement, almost a faint smile before she shut the door. Downstairs, Mason prepared supplies for the journey, checking his gun, packing water, rope, and enough food for 2 days. He moved with purpose. Protecting her wasn't an accident now. It was a decision. Upstairs, Nara sat on the cot, her hands wrapped around the cup of leftover coffee. She whispered his name once under her breath, testing its sound. She didn't trust him fully. Not yet. But she trusted him more than anyone else alive. And that was enough to make her breathe easier as the morning light filled the small room and the long road towards safety began to take shape. The morning they left Silver Creek dawned quiet and gray. A thin mist hung over the street, turning buildings into shadowy outlines against the pale sky. Mason had risen before first light, preparing the horse, checking supplies, and scanning the area around the livery for unwelcome visitors. The town still slept, only the occasional lamp burning in a distant window as he worked. When everything was ready, Mason climbed the stairs to the room above the stable and knocked softly on the door. The latch lifted almost immediately. Nara had been awake for hours, too anxious about the journey ahead to sleep. She stood in the doorway, the blanket still wrapped around her waist to cover the tear in her dress, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. Her eyes showed no trace of sleep, but held something new. Determination replacing the hollow emptiness Mason had seen at the fairground. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Mason noticed her hands weren't trembling anymore. Progress, he thought, small but real. They left through the back of the stable, avoiding the main street. Mason helped Nara onto the horse, careful not to touch her more than necessary as she settled into the front of the saddle. He handed her the reins, then mounted behind her, keeping the promised distance between them. She sat stiff, her back straight, but didn't flinch when he reached around to take the reins. The fact that she allowed even this much proximity told Mason Mum how desperate she was to leave Silver Creek behind. They rode west, out of town, as the first pale threads of sunlight began to spread across the horizon. Mason kept the horse at a steady walk, mindful of Nara's comfort. Neither spoke as they passed the last scattered buildings and entered the open country. Only when the town had completely disappeared behind them did Mason feel Nara's shoulders loosen slightly. The Wyoming landscape opened before them, vast stretches of sage-covered plains rising gradually toward distant hills. Occasional stands of aspen and cottonwood marked the paths of creeks through the otherwise open terrain. The air smelled of dust and wild sage, clean and sharp in the morning coolness. Mason guided the horse along game trails rather than the main road, wanting to avoid other travelers. He knew these lands well enough to navigate without marked paths. Years of working trail jobs had given him an instinctive sense of direction and an eye for reading the land. As they rode, he began sharing this knowledge with Nara, partly to ease the silence between them, partly to help her understand their surroundings. "See those clouds building in the west?" he said, pointing toward the horizon. "Flat bottoms, rounded tops, rain by afternoon but not a heavy storm, just enough to settle the dust." Nara followed his gaze, studying the distant clouds. She nodded, showing she understood. "Wind changes direction," she said quietly, surprising him with her observation. "Smell different." Mason raised his eyebrows slightly. He hadn't noticed the wind shift yet, but he trusted her senses. "You know weather patterns." "Apache watch sky," she replied. "Know when storms come, when water falls, when to move camp." It was the most she had spoken at once, and Mason took it as another small victory. As the morning progressed, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of mist. The horse maintained its steady pace, hooves thudding softly against the dirt. Mason pointed out various landmarks, a distinctive outcropping of rock, a lone pine standing sentinel on a distant rise, the faint line of mountains that marked their westward destination. "My cabin sits in those foothills," he said. "Built it 3 years ago when I needed somewhere quiet." Nara looked toward the distant mountains, far from people. "That's the idea." They stopped at midday near a small creek lined with cottonwoods. Mason dismounted first, then stepped back to give Nara space to do the same. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she moved carefully, easing herself down from the saddle. Mason pretended not to notice her discomfort, knowing pride when he saw it. He busied himself with the horse while she stretched her legs, walking a few paces away to scan their back trail. The creek provided welcome relief from the heat, its water cool and clear over smooth stones. Mason filled their canteens while Nara knelt downstream, washing her face and hands with careful, deliberate movements. When she finished, she remained by the water, examining her reflection in the still surface. Mason watched from the corner of his eye as he prepared their sparse meal. His attention caught on the small tribal marking visible on her wrist beneath the fading bruises. "That mark," Mason said, nodding toward her wrist, "means something special?" Nara hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Trust came hard to her as it did to him. Finally she spoke. "Father is chief. This shows his bloodline." Mason nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. The quality of her dress despite its damage, the way she carried herself even in fear, the value Harlan saw in her. She wasn't just any captive. She was a chief's daughter. "That's why they didn't give up," he said. "Yes." She looked away, back to the water. "Worth more than others." Her voice carried no self-importance, just a statement of fact, and an undercurrent of bitterness at being reduced to a commodity. "Your father's people," Mason asked carefully. "They looking for you?" Nara's expression darkened. Maybe think I dead, many days since taken." She stood then, ending the conversation, and moved to sit in the shade of a cottonwood. Mason didn't press. He brought her food, set it nearby, and returned to check on the horse. As he adjusted the saddle, he noticed her watching him, studying his movements with careful attention. "Why you help?" she asked suddenly. "No reason for you." Mason continued his work, not looking up immediately. It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself since the fairground. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet but clear. "Looked at you on that platform and saw someone who'd lost everything. I know what that feels like." He met her eyes then, allowing her to see the truth in his face. No elaborate explanation, no claim to heroism, just simple recognition of shared suffering. Nara held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a small nod of understanding. They finished their meal in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now, less tense, almost companionable. As they prepared to continue their journey, Mason noticed Nara moving more comfortably around him, keeping her distance but without the rigid fear of before. Back on the trail, the weather changed just as Mason had predicted. Clouds rolled in from the west, casting cool shadows across the land. A light rain began to fall, not enough to soak through clothing, but enough to dampen the dust and bring out the rich scents of sage and earth. The steady patter of raindrops on wide-brim hats created a soothing rhythm as they rode. "Good for tracks," Nara said, breaking the silence. "Rain covers them." Mason nodded. "Makes us harder to follow." She turned slightly, just enough to look at his face. "You think they follow?" "Don't know yet," he answered honestly, "but I don't trust empty land." They continued westward as the afternoon wore on. The rain stopped, leaving the sage glistening and the air fresh. The land began to change, rising in gentle swells toward the distant foothills. Scattered stands of pine appeared, growing thicker as they moved into higher country. The horse picked its way carefully over the increasingly rocky terrain, sure-footed but cautious. Mason kept his eyes moving, scanning both ahead and behind. Years on the trail had taught him never to trust apparent solitude. As they crossed a narrow ridge, he spotted something that made him tense, the distant flash of sunlight on metal, too brief and deliberate to be natural. "Hold up," he said quietly, placing his hand on the horse's neck to steady it. Nara sensed his change immediately. "What?" "Not sure. Might be nothing." But his tone said otherwise. He guided the horse into a stand of pines, where they were hidden from view of the trail. Dismounting, he helped Nara down, then reached for his rifle, the Winchester .73 he kept carefully maintained despite its age. "Stay with the horse," he said. "I'm going to have a look." Nara caught his arm, surprising both of them with the contact. "No, not alone." Her eyes held genuine concern and something more, the look of someone who had seen people walk away and never return. Mason considered arguing, then nodded. He wasn't her keeper. She had survived this long by making her own choices. "Stay low," he said. "Move quiet." They secured the horse and moved through the trees, keeping to shadows and natural cover. Mason led the way, rifle ready but not raised, conserving energy. Nara followed so silently he had to glance back several times to confirm she was still there. She moved like someone born to forest and mountain, each step placed with instinctive precision. They reached a rocky outcrop that provided a view of the trail below. Mason lay flat, motioning for Nara to do the same. Together they watched and waited. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then movement caught their eye. 3 riders making their way slowly along the trail they had just traveled. Even from this distance, Mason recognized the distinctive shape of one man's hat and the way another sat his horse. The same men from the fair in Silver Creek. "Ranch hands," Mason whispered. "Same ones watching the livery." Nara's breathing quickened slightly. "They track us." "Looks that way." They watched as the men studied the ground, following the hoof prints Mason's horse had left before the rain started. One rider pointed toward the ridge where Mason and Nara now hid. "They know which way we're headed," Mason said, "but not exactly where." Nara turned to look at him, her eyes serious. "What we do?" Mason considered their options. They could continue hiding, but that only delayed the inevitable. They could confront the men now, but that meant exposing Nara to danger. Or they could change their route, try to lose the trackers in rougher country. "We need to move," he decided. "Head north through the high country, then circle back west. More difficult terrain, but harder to follow." Nara nodded, accepting his strategy. They retreated to where they had left the horse, moving carefully to avoid dislodging stones or breaking branches. Mason helped Nara mount, then swung up behind her. "Hold tight," he said. "Going to be rough going for a while." She gripped the saddle horn as Mason guided the horse into a narrow game trail leading up into steeper country. The animal picked its way through rocky passages and between close-growing pines. Its breathing labored but steady. Mason kept them moving at a careful pace, mindful of both pursuit and the dangers of rushing on difficult terrain. As they climbed higher, the landscape changed dramatically. The open plains gave way to a series of steep ridges and deep draws covered in pine and aspen. Natural passages became harder to find, forcing them to zigzag through dense stands of trees and across rocky slopes. The horse was sure-footed, but tired more quickly in the thin air. By late afternoon, they had gained significant elevation. Mason finally called a halt in a sheltered draw where a small spring bubbled from beneath a rock face. The spot offered natural protection, a steep cliff at their back, dense trees screening them from below, and a clear view of the approach. "Rest here," Mason said, dismounting. "Horse needs it, and so do we." Nara slid down from the saddle with more confidence now, her body adapting to the rhythm of riding. She moved to the spring and drank deeply, then splashed water on her face. The cold mountain water seemed to revive her spirits. Mason tended to the horse, removing the saddle to let the animal cool, checking its legs for any strain from the difficult climb. He worked methodically, his mind focused on what lay ahead. The pursuers would have a harder time tracking them through the rocky terrain, but men like that didn't give up easily, not when money was involved. As he finished with the horse, he noticed Nara gathering something from among the rocks and trees. She returned with a handful of plants, small green leaves, roots, and a few berries. "Medicine," she explained, seeing his curious look. "Good for pain, for cuts." She gestured to her wrists, where the raw hide marks were healing slowly. Mason watched as she crushed some of the leaves between flat stones, adding a few drops of water to make a paste. Her movements were practiced, confident. This was knowledge passed down through generations. "You were a healer," he observed. "Learning to be," she corrected. Before, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. She applied the paste to her wrists, then offered some to Mason. "For your shoulder, you hurt." He blinked in surprise. He hadn't mentioned the old wound that sometimes ached in changing weather, a souvenir from his army days. "How did you know?" "Way you move," she said simply. "Careful with right arm when tired, less strong." Mason accepted the medicine with a nod of thanks, impressed by her observation. He applied it to his shoulder, feeling a cooling sensation almost immediately. "Army?" she asked. "Long time ago," he replied. "War between the states." Her expression darkened slightly at the mention of soldiers, but she didn't withdraw. "Which side?" "Union. Joined up in '63 after Gettysburg. Thought I was doing something right." He shook his head. "War's never what you think it'll be." Nara looked at him with unexpected understanding. "Apache no war. Always fighting. Mexicans, other tribes, now whites. Always someone wants our land, our people." For a moment they sat in shared silence. Two people from vastly different worlds united by their experience of conflict. The quiet between them felt different now, almost comfortable. As evening approached, Mason built a small, nearly smokeless fire using dry pine needles and dead wood. The flames gave little heat but provided enough light to see by as darkness settled around them. He kept the fire small and deep in the shelter of rocks to prevent its light from being visible from below. They ate a spare dinner of jerky and dried fruit, conserving their limited supplies. Mason kept his rifle across his knees, his ears attuned to any sound from the forest around them. Nara sat across from him, the firelight throwing shifting patterns across her face. She seemed lost in thought, staring into the flames. "Tomorrow," Mason said, breaking the silence. "We'll head northwest for a few hours, then swing back toward the cabin. Ground gets rougher before it opens up. Might slow us down, but it'll slow them more." Nara nodded, accepting his plan. Then she asked, "This cabin, you live there long?" "Built it 3 years ago. Don't stay there all the time. Trail work takes me away months at a stretch." She studied his face in the flickering light. "Lone always?" The question struck deeper than she likely intended. Mason looked away into the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. "Not always," he said finally. "Had a place before, in Montana territory." He hadn't shared this story in years. The words felt strange in his mouth, like artifacts from another life. "After the war, I claimed land under the homestead attacked, built everything from scratch. Felled the trees myself, split the shingles, fitted each log." His eyes took on a distant look. "Elizabeth, my wife, she planted an apple orchard that first spring. Said it was an act of faith." Mason's voice softened. "Our son Thomas loved to fish in the creek that ran through the property. Could sit there all day with just a wine and a can of worms. He fell silent. Nara waited, offering the rare gift of attentive silence. Influenza swept through that spring, he said finally. I was away driving cattle to market. By the time I returned, his words faltered. I buried them beneath the tallest pine on the western ridge, where they could see the sunset. The words hung in the night air, stark and heavy. Mason didn't look at Nara, didn't want to see pity in her eyes. But when she spoke, her voice held only understanding. My mother died when I young, she said. Sickness come to village. Many die. Father say I have her strength, her knowledge of plants. She looked down at her hands, her voice softening with memory. He teach me be strong for our people. Mason looked at her then, seeing not just a captive he had rescued on impulse, but a woman who carried her own burdens of loss and responsibility. Their eyes met across the small fire, and something shifted between them. A recognition, an acceptance. We should rest, Mason said after a moment. Long day tomorrow. Nara nodded, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders against the mountain night's chill. Mason took first watch, positioning himself where he could see the approach from below while still keeping the fire between them. As the night deepened, stars emerged in breathtaking clarity, the mountain air crystal clear above them. Mason watched Nara drift into an uneasy sleep, her body curled tight beneath the blanket, her face finally relaxed in slumber. The responsibility he felt toward her had changed somehow, become something more complicated than simple protection. He turned his attention back to the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the mountain, the soft hoot of an owl, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Behind these natural sounds, he strained to hear anything out of place. The clink of tack, the scrape of boot on stone, the whinny of a horse. But the night remained peaceful, at least for now. Hours later, when the moon had climbed high, he gently woke Nara for her turn at watch. She came alert instantly, without confusion, a skill born of necessity. Mason showed her what to listen for, what to watch, then settled himself nearby, rifle within reach. Despite his exhaustion, sleep came slowly as his mind circled through plans and contingencies. When it finally claimed him, his dreams were a confused tangle of past and present, Elizabeth's face fading into Nara's, his son's laughter echoing through empty mountain valleys. He woke to Nara's hand on his shoulder, her touch light but urgent. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading into pre-dawn gray. She put a finger to her lips, then pointed down the slope. Mason sat up carefully, following her gaze. In the dim light, he could make out movement. 3 figures making their way slowly up the draw, leading their horses to minimize noise. Their pursuers had found their trail, despite the difficult terrain. How long? Mason whispered. Just now see them, Nara replied softly. Still far. Mason assessed their situation quickly. They had the advantage of higher ground and early warning, but they were outnumbered. Fighting might be necessary, but escape was preferable. Get the horse ready, he said. We need to move now. While Nara gathered their few belongings and prepared the horse, Mason studied the approaching men through a gap in the rocks. He recognized 2 from Silver Creek, but the third was new, a taller man who moved with the confident ease of someone used to tracking and hunting. The way the others deferred to him marked him as their leader. That's him, Nara whispered, suddenly beside Mason. Her voice held a new tension. Harlan. Mason glanced at her, surprised. You know him? Her eyes never left the distant figure. He buy me from others. He who bring to fair. The hatred in her voice was controlled but absolute. Mason understood immediately. This wasn't just about money for Nara. It was about facing the man who had treated her as property. We're not fighting them here, Mason said firmly. Too risky. We go up and over the ridge, then down the other side. Terrain's in our favor. Nara looked like she wanted to argue but nodded instead. They moved to the waiting horse, Mason helping her mount before swinging up behind her. The animal sensed their urgency, shifting nervously beneath them. Mason guided the horse up a nearly invisible game trail that snaked through dense pines toward the ridgeline. They moved as quietly as possible, but on the rocky ground, complete silence was impossible. Behind them, shouts indicated their pursuers had spotted their movement. Ride hard now, Mason said, urging the horse to a faster pace. The animal responded gamely, picking its way up the steep trail with determined strides. Mason kept his weight shifted back, giving the horse better balance on the climb. Nara leaned forward, her body moving in rhythm with the animal's efforts. They reached the ridgeline just as the first shots rang out, bullets whining through the trees around them. Mason didn't return fire. Shooting from horseback at that range would be a waste of ammunition. Instead, he focused on getting them over the ridge and down the other side where the dense forest would provide better cover. The descent was more treacherous than the climb, the trail narrower and steeper. Mason gave the horse its head, trusting the animal's instincts more than his own judgment on the unfamiliar slope. Nara held tight to the saddle horn, her body tense but controlled. Behind them they could hear the sounds of pursuit, men cursing as they struggled up the same trail, horses snorting with effort. The delay gave Mason and Nara precious minutes of lead time, enough to reach the bottom of the slope and enter a narrow canyon that cut through the next ridge. The canyon walls rose steep and high on either side, the floor barely wide enough for two horses abreast. A shallow stream ran down its center, the water splashing around the horses' fetlocks as they followed its course. Mason kept them moving at a steady pace, knowing the canyon offered both protection and risk. It shielded them from gunfire but allowed only forward movement. "How far to end?" Nara asked, her voice tight with concern. "Mile, maybe less," Mason replied. "Opens into a valley. More cover there." They continued through the canyon, the horses' breathing growing labored with sustained effort. The sounds of pursuit grew distant behind them. Their lead was increasing. Mason allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. Then the canyon took a sharp turn, and Mason pulled the horse up short. Ahead, a massive tree had fallen across the narrow passage, its trunk too high to jump, its position leaving only the smallest gap to pass through on foot. A natural obstacle, but it might as well have been a fortress wall. "Have to go around," Nara suggested, scanning the steep canyon walls. Mason shook his head. "No time, they'll be here soon." He dismounted quickly, helping Nara down. "We make a stand here." She looked at him with alarm. "3 men, guns, and one narrow approach," Mason countered, already moving toward the fallen tree. "Makes the numbers more even." Understanding dawned in Nara's eyes. The bottleneck of the canyon and the natural barricade of the tree created a defensible position. She followed Mason to the tree, helping him drag dead wood and brush to strengthen their cover. Mason positioned himself at a small gap in the barrier, rifle ready. He checked his revolver, making sure it was fully loaded, then handed Nara his hunting knife. "Last resort," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "If they get past me." She took the knife, her expression solemn. "They won't take me alive again." Mason nodded once, understanding the promise she was making to herself. Then he turned his attention to the bend in the canyon where their pursuers would appear. They didn't have to wait long. The sound of horses splashing through the stream grew louder, and then 3 riders came into view around the bend. They pulled up short when they saw the barricade. "That's far enough," Mason called out, his rifle trained on the center rider. The men spread out as much as the narrow canyon allowed. The one in the middle, Harlan, studied the barricade with calculating eyes. He was older than Mason had expected, perhaps 50, with a weathered face and cold gray eyes. He wore a battered cavalry hat and a long duster, the bulge under his arm indicating a shoulder holster in addition to the revolver at his hip. "Don't recall inviting company on this trip," Mason said, his voice carrying the false calm that preceded violence. Harlan smiled without warmth. "Mason Reed, heard you'd quit the bounty trade." The familiarity of his tone caught Mason off guard. "We know each other?" "Crossed paths once or twice," Harlan replied. "I remember men who can shoot." He nodded toward the barricade. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you." "The lady disagrees." Harlan's smile widened. "Lady? That's an Apache squaw, Reed. Chief's daughter, worth 500 to the right people. Army's paying good money for leverage with the tribes." He leaned forward in his saddle. "I'll split it with you. Fair deal." Behind the barricade, Mason felt Nara tense at the words. He kept his voice level. "She's not for sale. Turn around, ride out. Simple as that." Harlan's expression hardened. "Nothing simple about it. I tracked that girl for 10 days before those idiots at the fair lost her. She's mine by right of capture. He patted his revolver. Don't make me come take her. You're welcome to try, Mason replied, his fingers settling more firmly on the trigger. For a long moment, tension hung in the air, thick as summer storm clouds. Then Harlan made a slight gesture, and the man to his right reached for his rifle. Mason fired first, his bullet striking the man's shoulder, spinning him backward off his horse. The animal bolted, splashing wildly up the canyon. The second man got off a wild shot that splintered wood beside Mason's head. Mason worked the lever on his Winchester and fired again, more deliberately this time. The bullet caught the man in the chest. He slumped forward over his saddle horn, then slid slowly to the ground. Harlan had drawn his revolver but held his fire, calculating odds that had suddenly turned against him. Two men down in as many seconds told him everything he needed to know about Mason's skill. "This isn't over, Reed," he called, backing his horse away from the fallen men. "That girl's worth more than you know." "She's not worth dying for," Mason answered. "Not today." Harlan's face twisted with anger, but he continued backing his horse away. "I'll find you," he promised. "Wherever you're headed, I'll be right behind." Then he wheeled his horse and galloped back down the canyon, leaving his wounded companions behind. The injured man struggled to his feet, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked at his dead companion, then at the barricade where Mason's rifle remained trained on him. Without a word, he staggered after Harlan, disappearing around the bend. Mason kept his position for several minutes, making sure it wasn't a trick. Only when he was certain they were alone did he lower his rifle and turn to Nara. She stood rigid, the knife clutched in white-knuckled fingers, her eyes fixed on the place where Harlan had been. "He'll come back," she said, not a question, but a certainty. "Yes," Mason agreed, "but we'll be long gone by then." They worked quickly to clear enough of the barricade for the horse to pass through, then continued down the canyon. The valley beyond spread wide and green before them, scattered groves of aspen glinting silver in the morning light. They rode at a fast trot, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the confrontation. Only when they reached the shelter of a large stand of trees did Mason call a halt. Nara's silence worried him. Since the canyon, she had barely spoken, her body tense against the saddle. "You all right?" he asked as he helped her dismount. She nodded, but her eyes were distant. "He said Chief's daughter. Worth 500. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Just money to him. To all of them. Mason hesitated, then placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the first time he had initiated contact between them. "Not to all of us." She looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time since the canyon. Something in her expression softened slightly. She reached up and briefly touched his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps gratitude. "We keep going," she said with new determination. Mason nodded, relieved to see the spark returning to her eyes. "We keep going. Cabin's less than half a day's ride now." As they remounted and continued westward, the sun climbed higher in a sky washed clean by yesterday's rain. The land opened before them, wild and beautiful in its emptiness. Behind them, a man with cold eyes and a wounded pride plotted his next move. But for now, they rode together through golden morning light, two survivors making their way toward the promise of sanctuary. The foothills rose around them as Mason and Nara continued westward through the afternoon. The landscape changed steadily, pine forest growing denser, rocky outcroppings more common, the air cooler and sharper with elevation. Small streams crisscrossed their path, running clear and cold over stone beds. The horse moved steadily despite the challenging terrain, sensing perhaps that rest waited ahead. Nara had grown quiet again after their encounter with Harlan, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the hollow emptiness of defeat, but the tense alertness of someone preparing for what might come next. She scanned the horizon constantly, her body attuned to every sound in the forest around them. Mason recognized the vigilance of a warrior, not a victim. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Mason guided them onto a barely visible trail that wound through a stand of ancient pines. The trail curved around a massive boulder and then suddenly opened onto a small clearing. There, nestled against the hillside and partially sheltered by overhanging rock, stood Mason's cabin. It wasn't large, a single room built of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one side. A covered porch extended across the front, its roof supported by sturdy pine posts. Near the cabin stood a small lean-to that served as both woodshed and stable. A spring bubbled from the rocks behind the structure, feeding a small creek that wound across the clearing before disappearing into the forest. Mason drew the horse to a halt at the edge of the clearing. "Home," he said simply. Nara studied the cabin with careful attention, noting the defensible position against the hillside, the clear view of approaches, the proximity to water and shelter. Mason saw approval in her eyes. She recognized the practical wisdom in his choice of location. "Good place," she said. "Hard to find." "That's the idea." They dismounted near the cabin, both stiff from the long ride. Mason led the horse to the lean-to, removing its saddle and bridle, while Nara explored the perimeter of the clearing. She moved with growing confidence, her steps sure and purposeful, as she inspected the terrain around their sanctuary. Mason watched her from the corner of his eye as he tended the horse. The torn dress and blanket wrap couldn't hide the natural grace in her movements. She belonged in this wild country far more than he ever would, despite his years on the frontier. This was the land of her ancestors, and something in her seemed to awaken with each passing hour away from captivity. When the horse was settled with grain and fresh water, Mason carried their supplies to the cabin. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing an interior layered with dust from months of absence. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the single window, illuminating floating moats and golden beams. The cabin's furnishings were sparse but practical: a stone fireplace with cooking hooks, a table and chair made from split logs, shelves holding basic supplies, and a bed frame built into one corner, its straw mattress covered with a canvas tarp for protection. A chest against the far wall contained extra clothing, ammunition, and other necessities for extended stays. Mason set their supplies on the table, then began the process of making the cabin livable again. He opened the shutters to let in fresh air, swept the worst of the dust outside, and checked the chimney for obstructions before building a small fire to ward off the mountain evening's chill. Nara appeared in the doorway as he worked, watching him with curious eyes. She stepped inside cautiously, her gaze taking in every detail of the space. "You sleep there," Mason said, pointing to the bed. "I'll take the floor." She looked at him, then at the bed, measuring his intention. When she found no threat in his expression, she nodded once in acceptance. "Need water," she said, gesturing to the canvas bucket hanging by the door. "For washing." Mason handed her the bucket. "Springs behind the cabin, water's cold but clean." She took the bucket and left, her movements more relaxed now that they had reached the relative safety of the cabin. Mason continued preparing for the evening, checking his supplies, arranging his bedroll on the floor near the door, positioning weapons within easy reach. Old habits from trail days that now seemed more necessary than ever. Through the window, he watched Nara kneel by the spring, filling the bucket before setting it aside. She loosened her hair from its braid, letting it fall in a black wave down her back. Then she cupped her hands in the spring and brought water to her face, washing away the dust of travel with slow, deliberate movements. The simple act held a ritual quality, as if she were cleansing herself of more than just physical grime. Mason looked away, feeling like an intruder on a private moment. He busied himself with preparing a meal from their provisions: dried beans softened in water, salt pork, and the last of their hardtack. Simple trail food, but hot and filling. When Nara returned, carrying the water bucket with both hands, her face and arms were clean, her hair combed with her fingers and rebraided more neatly. She set the bucket near the fire to warm, then joined Mason at the table. They ate in companionable silence as darkness gathered outside the cabin's walls. The food was plain but satisfying, and Mason noticed Nara ate with more appetite than before, another small sign of healing. After they finished, Mason stoked the fire while Nara moved the now warm water to the far corner of the cabin. She looked at him expectantly. Understanding her need for privacy, Mason nodded and stepped outside onto the porch, closing the door behind him. The night had settled fully over the mountains, stars emerging in breathtaking clarity above the dark silhouettes of pines. Mason leaned against the porch post, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the soft whisper of wind through needled branches. He found comfort in these sounds, in the wildness they represented. Here, far from towns and people, the world made a simple kind of sense. His thoughts turned to Nara, to the unexpected path that had brought them together. He had acted on instinct at the fairground, with no plan beyond removing her from immediate danger. Now they were bound in ways he hadn't anticipated, their fates entwined against a common threat. He found himself surprisingly at peace with this development. After years of drifting, of belonging nowhere and to no one, the responsibility felt like an anchor, rather than a burden. The cabin door opened behind him, spilling warm lamplight onto the porch boards. Nara stood in the doorway, transformed by her simple ablutions. She had washed her dress as best she could, the torn seam roughly mended with what looked like plant fibers twisted into thread. Her face was composed, dignified, despite the lingering marks of her captivity. "Your turn," she said, gesturing inside. Mason nodded his thanks and entered the cabin while she took his place on the porch. The warm water was a luxury after days of Cold Creek bathing. He washed quickly but thoroughly, changing into the clean shirt and pants he kept in the cabin's chest. The familiar clothes, smelling faintly of cedar from their storage, brought a deeper sense of homecoming. When he had finished, he called softly to Nara. She returned inside, closing and barring the door against the night and whatever dangers it might hold. The single room felt different with both of them occupying it, smaller yet somehow more complete. The space between them charged with unspoken awareness of their unusual circumstances. Mason checked his guns one last time, a nightly ritual that had kept him alive through years of trail work. Nara watched his movements with interest as she settled onto the edge of the bed, her fingers absently tracing the tribal mark on her wrist. "What that gun?" she asked, nodding toward the Winchester he was cleaning. "Winchester 73, he replied. "Had it since the war. Most accurate repeating rifle made." "You shoot good," she observed. "In canyon. Not hesitate." Mason's hands paused in their work. "Had practice." "Kill men before?" He looked up, meeting her direct gaze. "Yes." She nodded, unsurprised. "In war?" "In war. On the trail. Bounty hunting for a while." He resumed cleaning the rifle, his movements precise and practiced. "Did what I had to." "To survive," she said softly. "Sometimes." He slid the cleaning rod through the barrel one final time. "Sometimes for money, sometimes because it seemed right at the time." He set the rifle aside, not proud of all of it. She considered his words, her expression thoughtful. Apache warriors kill too. For tribe, for honor, for survival. She looked down at her hands. Life hard, choices hard. The simple understanding in her voice settled something in Mason's chest, a knot of old guilt loosening slightly. They came from different worlds, but some truths transcended those boundaries. The weight of necessary violence, the complexity of survival in harsh lands. "Your father," Mason asked, changing the subject. "What's his name?" "Nakoe," she replied, "means tracks the enemy. He lead our band of Chiricahua." "Good leader?" "Strong, wise." Her voice softened with pride and longing. "Teach me be strong too." "He did well," Mason observed. "You survived when many wouldn't have." She accepted the compliment with quiet dignity, then asked a question of her own. "Why you leave Montana? After family gone?" Mason hadn't expected the question, though he should have. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. After they died, the silence was the worst part. He poked at the embers, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. The house felt hollow. Even the birds seemed to sing differently. He exhaled slowly, sold it all for less than it was worth, just wanted distance. "You became hunter of men then," she observed, not as judgment, but understanding. "Bounty hunting doesn't ask much of a man, except a steady hand and a willingness to travel." His eyes met hers briefly. Sleeping in a different place each night means no memories have time to take root. "But you stop," she noted. "Build cabin here." "A man can outrun his past," he agreed, "but not himself. Eventually you either find a place to stand or you fall." She nodded, understanding in her eyes, but still alone. It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. "Seems safer that way." Nara studied him across the fire-lit space between them. "Safer," she echoed. "But lonely." Mason had no answer for that, so he changed the subject. "We should rest." Been a long few days. Nara accepted the shift in conversation, stretching out on the bed while Mason settled on his bedroll near the door. He extinguished the lamp, leaving only the firelight to illuminate the cabin's interior. Mason, Nara's voice came softly through the dimness. Yes? Thank you for this place. Get some sleep, Nara, he replied, her name still new on his tongue. We're safe for tonight. She seemed to accept this, her breathing gradually slowing into the rhythm of sleep. Mason lay awake longer, listening to the cabin settle around them, the fire crackle in the hearth, the wind whisper at the eaves. For the first time in years, his solitary refuge held another's presence, and he found he didn't mind the change nearly as much as he might have expected. When sleep finally claimed him, it was deeper and more restful than any he had known since leaving Montana behind. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the cabin window and the cheerful sound of birdsong from the surrounding forest. Mason woke instantly, alert from years of trail habit, his hand reaching for the revolver beside his bedroll before memory caught up with instinct. The cabin, Nara, safety, at least for now. He sat up surveying the quiet room. The bed was empty, the blanket neatly folded at its foot. For a moment, alarm shot through him. Had she fled during the night? Then he heard movement on the porch, soft footsteps crossing wooden boards, and relief replaced concern. Mason rose, pulling on his boots before stepping outside. The morning air carried a chill that promised autumn's approach, fresh and sharp in his lungs. Nara stood at the edge of the porch, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink. She had washed again, her hair damp and loosely braided, her torn dress looking cleaner in the morning light. She turned at the sound of the door, offering a small nod of greeting. Something had changed in her overnight, a new steadiness in her posture, a clarity in her gaze that spoke of decisions made during quiet hours. Morning, Mason said, moving to stand beside her at the porch rail. Good day for hunting, she observed, nodding toward the clear sky. Need meat. Mason raised an eyebrow, surprised by the practical assessment. You're right, supplies won't last long. I help, she said, not a question but a statement of intent. Mason studied her face, seeing determination there. You know how to hunt? She straightened slightly, a flash of pride crossing her features. Apache women not helpless, know how to track, to hunt, to prepare meat. Never thought you were helpless, Mason replied honestly. Just asking what you know. She seemed to accept this, her posture relaxing. With bow, I hunt well. With knife. She glanced at his rifle. Never use that. Mason considered this. Having her help would make their situation more sustainable, and it clearly mattered to her to contribute rather than merely receive protection. Her skills, developed in a lifetime before captivity, deserved respect. We'll make you a bow, he decided. There's good wood for it, and I have extra knives in the chest. The smile that briefly touched her lips transformed her face, bringing life to features that had been guarded for so long. It was gone quickly, but the effect lingered in Mason's mind as they set about preparing for the day ahead. After a simple breakfast of coffee and the last of their trail rations, they began the work of settling into the cabin. Mason showed Nara the spring, the best hunting approaches, the places where edible plants grew most abundantly. She absorbed everything with quick intelligence, occasionally offering knowledge of her own about plants he had never considered useful. By midday, they had established a rhythm of cooperation that felt surprisingly natural. Mason cut firewood while Nara gathered plants she recognized as medicinal or edible. When he checked his traps and found 2 rabbits, she demonstrated her skill at preparing the meat, wasting nothing, preserving even the bones for tools and the fur for later use. As they worked, Mason found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. The change in her was remarkable. With each hour of freedom and purpose, more of her true self emerged from behind the protective walls of captivity. She moved with growing confidence, spoke more frequently, even hummed softly to herself when engaged in familiar tasks. For Mason, the experience was both unsettling and oddly satisfying. His solitary existence had been disrupted, yes, but replaced with something that felt inexplicably right. Having another person in his space, particularly this person with her quiet strength and surprising knowledge, made the cabin feel more like a home than it ever had before. In the afternoon, they worked together to craft a bow from a flexible ash branch Mason had been saving for tool handles. Nara directed the process with sure knowledge, showing him how to shape the wood, where to attach the sinew string, how to balance the pull for accuracy. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, muscle memory guiding actions her mind must have feared forgotten during captivity. When the bow was finished, she tested its draw with a critical eye. "Good," she pronounced finally. "Now arrows." They spent the remaining daylight making arrows from straight branches, tipping them with carefully shaped stone points that Nara napped with impressive skill. Mason watched her hands work the stone, transforming it with precise blows into deadly sharp points. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "Grandfather teach me," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Say women need know this if men not return from hunt." Her fingers traced the edge of a finished point. "Old ways important. Keep us alive when new things fail." Mason thought of his own reliance on manufactured weapons, on ammunition that couldn't be replaced without returning to civilization. There was wisdom in her approach, in knowledge that didn't depend on commerce or industry. By evening, Nara had a functional bow and a dozen arrows stored in a quiver made from a piece of leather Mason had saved from his last saddle repair. They ate rabbit stew enriched with wild onions and herbs Nara had gathered, the meal far more satisfying than the trail rations. As darkness fell, they sat before the fire, the comfortable silence of shared work between them. Mason cleaned his guns while Nara sorted through the plants she had collected, binding some into bundles for drying, crushing others into poultices and medicines. "Your wrists," Mason noted, seeing that the rawhide marks had faded considerably. "Looking better." Nara nodded, touching one wrist lightly. "Plants help. Old knowledge." She held up a small bundle of leaves. "This stopped bleeding. This," she indicated another plant, "for fever, for pain." "Useful skills," Mason observed. "I was learning to be medicine woman," she said, her voice softening with remembrance. "Before capture." "You still are," Mason replied simply. She looked up at him, something vulnerable and questioning in her gaze. "Here, alone?" Mason met her eyes steadily. "Knowledge doesn't die because circumstances change. You're still who you were. Still carry what you learned." Her expression shifted, surprise giving way to thoughtful consideration. It occurred to Mason that she might never have considered her identity as something separate from her tribe, her role, her place among her people. The idea that she carried her value within herself, regardless of circumstance, seemed to touch something deep. "You teach yourself to be alone," she observed, "after family gone." Mason considered this, not something you learn so much as endure until the edges of the wound aren't so raw. His eyes held a quiet reflection. "I think we're built to connect, to land, to people. Being truly alone goes against that nature." He looked at her directly. "That's why finding someone who understands feels like breathing again after being underwater." "Yes," she nodded slowly. "Adapt." The words seemed to settle between them, bridging their very different paths to this shared moment. Both had lost what anchored them to the world. Both had found ways to continue despite that loss. And now, unexpectedly, both found themselves creating something new in this remote cabin. The following days fell into a pattern that grew more comfortable with each passing sunrise. Mornings began with Mason checking the perimeter while Nara prepared a simple breakfast. They hunted together, Mason with his rifle, Nara with her new bow. Her aim proved as deadly as he had suspected, her knowledge of animal habits allowing them to bring down game with minimal effort. They gathered wild foods to supplement their meat, berries, roots, pine nuts, whatever the forest offered. Nara taught Mason which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, which were best avoided. He showed her how to set more efficient traps, how to smoke meat for longer preservation, how to repair the cabin's occasional leaks and drafts. Each day, Nara ventured a little farther from the cabin, her confidence growing as she reclaimed her connection to the land. Each night, they returned to their shared space, the distance between them diminishing in small but meaningful increments. They spoke more freely as days passed, sharing stories and knowledge across the cultural divide that separated their experiences. Mason told her about his years on cattle drives, about the homestead in Montana, about the battles he had seen during the war. Nara shared tales of her people, their migrations following game, their ceremonies marking the seasons, their long resistance against those who sought to take their lands. Between them grew a mutual respect born of recognized strength. Neither pitied the other for what they had lost. Both acknowledged the resilience it took to continue. A week into their coexistence, Mason returned from checking his traps to find Nara kneeling by the spring, washing her torn dress yet again. The garment was clearly beyond real repair, the fabric worn thin, the tears barely held together by her makeshift stitching. Without a word, Mason went into the cabin and opened the chest where he kept his spare belongings. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved against memory's pain, lay a bundle he had not opened in years. He carried it outside and approached Nara, who looked up questioningly. "Elizabeth's things," he said simply, holding out the bundle. "Might fit you, better than what you have now." Nara's eyes widened, understanding the significance of the offer. She rose slowly, water dripping from her hands. "You sure?" Mason nodded, a tightness in his throat that had surprised him. She'd want them used, not stored away in darkness. Nara accepted the bundle with careful hands, her eyes on Mason's face rather than the gift itself. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying weight beyond their simplicity. Later that day, when Mason returned from hunting, he found Nara waiting on the porch. She wore one of Elizabeth's dresses, a simple blue cotton garment that had been modified with careful cuts and stitching to better fit her smaller frame. She had added elements of her own culture, a belt woven from plant fibers, decorative beading salvaged from her old dress incorporated at the neckline. The sight stopped Mason in his tracks, not because she looked like Elizabeth, she didn't, not in the slightest, but because the dress had transformed from a painful relic into something alive again, useful, part of a continuing story rather than an ended one. "Is good?" Nara asked, uncertain in the face of his silence. Mason found his voice. "It's good. Suits you." She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes, perhaps the first he had seen from her. The expression changed her entire face, revealing the woman who existed beneath the layers of survival and caution. That evening, as they ate dinner, a comfortable silence between them, Mason found himself contemplating the strange path that had led them here. A month ago, he had been alone, drifting through frontier towns, taking occasional work, belonging nowhere. Now his cabin held another presence, his days a shared purpose, his future suddenly less certain but somehow more substantial. "I've been thinking," he said finally, setting down his plate. "Harlan's still out there. Man like that doesn't give up easy." Nara's expression darkened at the mention of her former captor. "He come here?" Eventually, Mason acknowledged. "He strikes me as the type to hold a grudge, especially after losing 2 men. She nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "What we do?" Mason considered the question carefully. "We have options. Could move on, find somewhere new, could try to locate your people, get you back to them, or we could stay, prepare, make this place defensible." Nara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of careful consideration. "My people may not be where they were. Apache moved with seasons, with army pressure." She touched the tribal mark on her wrist, a gesture that had become familiar to Mason. "Many moons since taken. Maybe they think me dead." "We could still try to find them," Mason offered. "Maybe," she agreed, "but not now, not with Harlan hunting." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "This place good, defensible. We make it strong." Mason studied her face, looking for any sign of hesitation. "You're sure this isn't your home?" "Home is people," she said simply. "Not place," then more softly, "you give me safety when no one else would. That means something." The words settled between them, honest and unadorned. Mason nodded, accepting her decision and the responsibility it entailed. "Then we stay," he said, "and we prepare." The next days brought a new focus to their activities. Beyond hunting and gathering, they began strengthening the cabin's defenses. Mason dug a shelter beneath the floor, a hidden space large enough for Nara to hide in if danger approached. They established sight lines through the surrounding forest, cleared brush that might provide cover for an approaching enemy, set up early warning systems of trip, wires, and noisemakers. Nara proved as adept at defensive preparation as she was at hunting and medicine. Her Apache upbringing had included learning to protect the camp, to spot danger before it arrived, to create advantages in difficult terrain. She and Mason worked together smoothly, each contributing knowledge the other lacked. Between these practical tasks, life at the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. They shared the daily work without discussion, Mason handling the heavier task of cutting wood and maintaining the structure, Nara focusing on food preparation, medicine, and crafting items they needed. Neither questioned the division, it simply evolved from their respective strengths. Evenings found them by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, the space between them comfortable in a way Mason had not experienced since his family's loss. Nara spoke more freely now, sharing stories of her childhood, her training as a healer, her people's ways. Mason found himself doing the same, opening doors to memories he had kept locked away for years. On the 10th night since reaching the cabin, as a storm lashed the roof with rain and wind howled through the pines outside, Nara asked a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "When danger pass," she said, looking up from the arrowhead she was shaping, "what then?" Mason set aside the trap he was repairing. "What do you mean? If Harlan not find us, or if we drive him away?" Her eyes met his steadily. "What happens to me? To us?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had directly addressed. Mason considered his answer carefully, wanting to offer honesty without presumption. "That would be your choice," he said finally. "If you want to find your people, I'll help you try. If you want to stay here, you can. If you want to go somewhere else entirely, start new, that's your right too." She studied his face, searching for something beyond his words. "And you? What you want?" Mason hadn't allowed himself to consider that question. Not fully. The immediate need for safety had overshadowed any longer view. But faced with Nara's direct inquiry, he found the answer came easier than expected. "I've been alone a long time," he said slowly. "Thought that's what I wanted, what I deserved maybe, after everything. But these past days," he gestured around the cabin at the life they had begun building together. "This feels right in a way nothing has for years." Nara nodded as if his words confirmed something she had already sensed. "For me also," she admitted quietly. "First I stay because safer than running. Now I stay because I want to." The simple honesty of her statement touched something in Mason that had been dormant for too long. He reached across the space between them, offering his hand palm up, not demanding, just offering connection. After a moment's hesitation, Nara placed her hand in his, the contact light but deliberate. "Then we face whatever comes," Mason said, "and after that, we decide the future together." Nara's fingers tightened slightly around his, the pressure and affirmation more eloquent than words. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. But within the cabin's walls, something weathered and broken in both of them began the slow process of healing. As they sat by the fire, hands still joined in that tentative connection, the sound of the rain on the roof created a cocoon of isolation that felt not like loneliness, but like sanctuary. Whatever dangers waited beyond the storm, whatever decisions lay ahead, this moment held its own complete truth. Two souls who had lost everything, finding in each other the courage to begin again. In that quiet understanding, with the fire's warmth against the storm's chill, they discovered a peace neither had thought to find again in this harsh and beautiful world. The storm passed by morning, leaving the forest washed clean, droplets glittering on pine needles in the early light. As days turned to weeks, Mason and Nara fell into a rhythm of life that felt increasingly natural. They reinforced the cabin, set traps along likely approach routes, and established warning systems that would alert them to anyone coming up the mountain. But even as they prepared for danger, they built something more than just defenses. One crisp autumn morning, Mason returned from checking his trap line to find Nara kneeling by a patch of ground she had cleared near the spring. She was planting something, her hands working the soil with practiced care. "What's that?" he asked, setting down his gear. "Medicine garden," she replied, not looking up. "Winter coming. Need plants close when snow deep." Mason watched her work, struck by the permanence of the act. Planting meant staying, meant believing in a future here. "Good thinking," he said simply, but they both understood what remained unspoken. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Mason pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden carving of a bird, its wings spread wide. He'd been working on it in stolen moments, an old skill from his homestead days when long winter nights demanded occupation. "For you," he said, holding it out to her. "Saw you watching the hawks yesterday." Nara took the carving, her fingers tracing the smooth lines. She didn't comment on its beauty or thank him with words. Instead, she reached behind her neck and removed something, a small leather pouch on a cord. Opening it, she produced a polished stone etched with markings similar to her wrist tattoo. "Protection," she said, placing it in his palm. "Family stone, passed through generations." Mason understood the weight of the gift, something she had managed to keep hidden even during her captivity, a connection to her people that she now shared with him. He closed his fingers around it, nodding his acceptance. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the clearing and weighing down pine branches. It brought a deeper quiet to the mountains, a stillness broken only by the occasional crack of a branch shedding its white burden. Mason and Nara kept mostly to the cabin now, venturing out only for necessities. On a particularly cold morning, Mason woke to find Nara already up, standing tense by the window. "Smoke," she said when she sensed him behind her. "There." She pointed toward a distant ridge. Mason looked where she indicated. A thin column of smoke rose against the pale sky, too controlled to be a wildfire, too large for a lone traveler. "How many?" he asked. "Many fires, many people." They watched the smoke for a long time, neither speaking. Both knew what it likely meant. Harlan hadn't given up. "He waited for snow," Mason said finally. "Thinks it gives him advantage. Harder for us to run." Nara's expression hardened. "We not run." "No," Mason agreed. "Not this time." They spent the day in preparation, checking weapons, positioning supplies, ensuring every aspect of their defenses was ready. As darkness fell, they ate a simple meal in silence, each lost in thought about what morning might bring. "Mason," Nara said finally, her voice soft in the firelit room, "if tomorrow goes wrong—" "It won't," he interrupted, not wanting to hear what might follow. "If," she insisted. "Want, finding you at fair, best thing in my life." Mason looked at her across the table, at the woman who had transformed from a broken captive to a fierce partner. "Nara," he said, her name feeling right in his mouth. "I was lost before you. Just didn't know how much." She held his gaze, then reached across the table to take his hand. No more words were needed. Dawn broke cold and clear. They were ready before first light, positioned at different points with clear sight lines to the approaches. Mason had insisted Nara take the rifle. She had proven herself a natural shot during their hunting, while he kept his revolver and a shotgun he'd had stashed in the cabin. The first sign came just after sunrise. Movement at the edge of the clearing. 3 men, spreading out, using trees for cover. Not a frontal assault, but a careful positioning. Mason caught Nara's eye from across the clearing and signaled with a subtle hand motion. She acknowledged with the barest nod, adjusting her position slightly. Then a voice called out, carrying clearly in the cold air. "Reed, I know you're up there. Let's talk business." Mason remained silent. Let Harlan think his position unknown. "Got 10 men with me," the voice continued. "Nowhere to run this time." Movement to the left drew Mason's attention. 2 more men working their way around the side of the clearing. Harlan was spreading his forces, looking to surround them. The bounty hunter was being more cautious this time. Still, Mason held his fire. Patience had saved his life more than once. "The girl's worth more now," Harlan called. "Army's offering 1,000 for the chief's daughter. You can walk away rich, Reed, or you can die on this mountain. Your choice." A glint of metal caught Mason's eye, sunlight on a rifle barrel, poorly concealed behind a fallen log. The man was too close to the cabin, in a position that threatened their escape route. Mason raised his hand slightly, catching Nara's attention, then pointed discreetly. She saw it too. Without hesitation, she sighted the rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the morning stillness. The man behind the log jerked backward, then lay still. Instantly, the clearing erupted in gunfire. Bullets thudded into the cabin walls, splintering wood and shattering the window. Mason fired the shotgun, driving back 2 men who had tried to rush forward in the confusion. The heavy buckshot tore through the underbrush, forcing them to retreat. "Kill the woman!" Harlan's voice rose above the gunfire. But I want Reed alive. Mason ducked as a bullet whined past his ear. He rolled to a new position, fired twice more. A cry told him at least one shot had found its mark. Across the clearing, Nara was a shadow among shadows, moving with the silence her people had perfected over generations, the Winchester speaking death each time she paused. 3 men down now, maybe 4. But Harlan's men were closing in, tightening the circle. A bullet struck the ground inches from Mason's boot. Another splintered the corner post of the cabin porch. They couldn't hold this position much longer. Mason caught movement to his right, a man charging toward Nara's position. Without thinking, he broke cover, firing as he ran. The man went down, but the movement exposed Mason. He felt the punch of impact before he heard the shot, a hot slice across his ribs that spun him half around. "Mason!" Nara's voice sharp with alarm. "I'm fine," he called back, though the spreading warmth along his side told him otherwise. He pressed a hand to the wound, felt blood seeping between his fingers. A graze, but deep enough. The gunfire had paused. An unnatural silence settled over the clearing. "Looks like you're bleeding, Reed," Harlan's voice came again, closer now. "How long you think you can keep this up?" Mason didn't answer. He moved carefully behind a stump, trying to spot Harlan's position. "I've lost some men," the bounty hunter continued, "but I've still got enough to finish this. Give up the girl. I'll let you walk away." "You know that's not happening, Harlan," Mason called back, wanting to draw attention away from where Nara had last been. "Then I guess we do this the hard way." A new volley of shots tore through the clearing. Mason returned fire, but his vision was beginning to blur at the edges. The blood loss was worse than he'd thought. Then, from somewhere to his left, came a sound that didn't belong, a high, warbling cry that echoed off the mountainside. It rose and fell in a pattern that sent a chill through Mason, not caused by the cold or his injury. The gunfire faltered, then stopped. In the silence that followed, the cry came again, answered this time by a similar sound from beyond the clearing. Then another, and another. "What the hell is that?" one of Harlan's men shouted, fear evident in his voice. Mason knew. It was a signal. Nara's signal. From the forest emerged figures on horseback, at least a dozen, materializing from the trees like spirits. Men with painted faces and rifles, feathers and beads woven into their hair, moving with the fluid grace of those born to the saddle. Apache warriors. Their leader rode forward, a tall man whose very posture spoke of authority. The tribal markings on his face matched the tattoo on Nara's wrist. Harlan's remaining men panicked, firing wildly at the newcomers. The Apache returned fire with deadly precision. In moments, half of Harlan's force lay dead or wounded. "Fall back!" Harlan shouted. "Fall back, damn you!" The bounty hunter emerged from behind a boulder, firing as he retreated. Mason raised his revolver, but his hand shook, the barrel wavering. Before he could steady himself, a single shot rang out from the cabin roof. Harlan staggered, clutching his chest. He looked up in disbelief to where Nara perched, the Winchester still trained on him. Their eyes met across the distance. Harlan opened his mouth as if to speak, then crumpled to the ground. The remaining bounty hunters fled into the forest, pursued by several Apache riders. Others dismounted, moving through the clearing to check the fallen. Mason struggled to his feet, one hand pressed to his wounded side. He made his way toward the cabin as Nara descended from her position. She ran to him, concern etched on her face as she saw the blood soaking his shirt. "Not bad," he assured her, though his legs felt increasingly unsteady. The Apache leader approached them, his gaze fixed on Nara with an intensity that needed no translation. He dismounted, standing tall before them. "Nakohe," Nara whispered, her voice catching. The man's stern expression broke, giving way to something raw and powerful. He stepped forward and embraced Nara, holding her as if afraid she might vanish. Mason swayed slightly, darkness threatening at the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was Nara turning back toward him, her face caught between joy and concern, her father's arms still around her shoulders. He woke to the scent of herbs and wood smoke, a familiar smell that had become associated with safety in his mind. The cabin ceiling came into focus above him. He was in his own bed, his side bandaged, the pain dulled to a manageable throb. "He wakes," said a voice. Nara's voice, though not directed at him. He turned his head to see her sitting nearby, grinding something in a small bowl. Beyond her, the Apache leader, Nakohe, stood by the fire, his bearing no less impressive inside the small cabin than it had been on horseback. "Your woman has healing hands," Nakohe said in careful English. "Like her mother." "Your woman." Mason glanced at Nara, who continued her work without looking up, though a slight flush colored her cheeks. "How long?" Mason asked. "2 days," Nara replied. "Fever broke this morning." Nakohe approached the bed, studying Mason with eyes that seemed to see more than most. "My daughter says you freed her, protected her when no one else would." Mason struggled to sit up, wincing at the pull in his side. "She protected me, too." The chief nodded as if this confirmed something. "She says you offer her choice. Stay or go. No man owns her." "That's right." A long, measuring look. Then, "Good man thinks this way." Over the next days, as Mason recovered, he learned the story. Nakohe's band had been searching for Nara since her capture months ago. They had tracked rumors and whispers across the territory, following her trail through towns and trading posts, always a step behind. When winter threatened to end their search until spring, they had made camp on the ridge, unwilling to abandon hope while so close. It was Nara's signal, a call she had learned as a child, used by her people when separated in the forest, that had finally brought them together. "Will you go with them?" Mason asked one evening as they sat alone by the fire, the Apache camp now established in the clearing below the cabin. Nara looked at him steadily. "Father asked me return." Mason nodded, a heaviness settling in his chest that had nothing to do with his healing wound. He had always known this might happen, had told himself from the beginning that her path was her own to choose. Still, the prospect of returning to solitude after knowing her presence left him hollow. "Your people need you," he said. "I understand." Nara continued to study him, her expression thoughtful. "He asked you come too." Mason's head came up sharply. "What?" "Apache need allies, good men who understand white ways but respect our ways." She leaned forward slightly. "Need healers too, people who know plants, who help sick, wounded." "I'm no healer," Mason said. "You learn, I teach." Her eyes held his. "If you want. If you want." The same words he had spoken to her that day in Silver Creek, offering freedom without demand. Now she returned them to him, a gift of equal value. "And if I want to stay here?" he asked quietly. "Then I stay too," she replied without hesitation. The simplicity of her answer took his breath away. After everything, her captivity, her reunion with her people, she would choose him, choose this life they had begun building together. "We decide together," she reminded him, echoing his words from nights before. "Remember?" Mason remembered. He remembered everything, the fairground, the journey, the storm, the way her hand had felt in his. He looked around the cabin that had been merely shelter before her arrival, now transformed into something that felt like home. "We could do both," he said finally. "Stay here, but visit your people. Learn from them. Maybe help them understand the changes coming." Nara smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Medicine cabin," she said. "Healing place between two worlds. Is that what you want?" She nodded, then moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What I want," she said softly, "is you. This place. Peace we find here." Mason took her hand, their fingers interlacing naturally now. "Then that's what we'll build." And they did. 1 year later, the cabin had transformed. A second structure stood nearby, built with the help of Nakohe's people, its design a blend of Apache wisdom and frontier practicality. Inside, shelves lined the walls, holding jars of dried herbs, tinctures, salves, and bandages. A treatment area occupied the center of the room, surrounded by beds for those who needed longer care. People came from all directions, settlers from distant homesteads, travelers along the mountain trails, members of Nara's tribe, and occasionally other native peoples. Word had spread of the mixed-blood healer and her white husband who offered care to anyone in need, regardless of origin. Mason stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Nara showed a young Apache woman how to prepare a poultice for wound healing. Her confidence had grown over the months, her natural talents flourishing in this place where she was neither captive nor outsider but simply herself. Behind them, in a cradleboard leaning against the cabin wall, their infant daughter slept peacefully, her small features a perfect blend of both bloodlines. They had named her Elizabeth Taluta, honoring both the past they had lost and the heritage they would preserve. Nara looked up, caught Mason watching them. The smile she gave him still took his breath away, a year later. She excused herself from her student and crossed to where he stood, sliding naturally into the space beside him. "Happy?" she asked simply. Mason looked at their home, at the healing lodge busy with activity, at their sleeping child. He thought of how far they had come from that day at the fairground. A journey measured not just in miles but in healing, in trust rebuilt, in love discovered in the most unlikely place. "Yes," he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. "More than I ever thought possible." As they stood together watching the life they had built from broken pieces, Mason reflected on the strangeness of fate. He had gone to Silver Creek that day seeking nothing but temporary shelter, expecting only to pass through like so many places before. Instead, he had found a purpose, a partner, and finally a peace he had thought forever lost. Beneath his shirt, he still carried the stone Nara had given him that night by the fire, a protection charm that had somehow worked its magic in ways neither of them could have foreseen, not by preventing danger, but by giving them the strength to face it together, by transforming two solitary wounded souls into something stronger than either could have been alone. In the mountains around them, winter was approaching again, but this year they welcomed it without fear, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other the most powerful medicine of all, a home where both belonged, a love built on choice rather than possession, and the quiet miracle of beginning anew.